They came like thunder on the sea, ships with dragon heads slicing through fog, and warriors with braided hair and axes dripping with legend. For centuries, the Vikings raided, traded, and conquered from the coasts of North America to the palaces of Constantinople. Their age was formed in blood, bravery, and myth. But just as suddenly as it began, it ended. Not with one final battle, but with something far more human: change. So what really happened? Why did the Viking Age come to a halt? Was it the clash of steel or the whisper of a prayer that ended it all? And how did these feared raiders turn into settlers, kings, and Christians? Today, we sail back in time to trace the rise and fall of the Viking Age. Not the Hollywood version, but the real story. One filled with surprising twists, inspiring resilience, and a legacy that still echoes across Scandinavia and beyond. The making of the Vikings. Let's start at the beginning. It began not with bloodshed, but with geography. Picture Scandinavia around the 8th century. Harsh winters, short growing seasons, rugged mountains, and dense forests hemmed in by long, jagged coastlines. This wasn't land built for leisure. It was land that bred resilience. It pushed its people to be tough, resourceful, and fiercely independent. But it was from this rugged environment that the Norse seafarers, the Vikings, emerged. The word Viking itself comes from the Old Norse Vikingr, meaning a pirate raid or sea expedition. And yes, the Viking Age is often defined by its raids. But it's important to understand why they took to the seas in the first place. Around 793 CE, something snapped. On the English coast, at a small monastery called Lindisfarne, Norse raiders launched an attack that sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described it as fiery dragons flying in the sky and great famine and terror. That marked the beginning of what historians called the Viking Age, usually pegged from 793 to 1066 AD. So what caused this sudden eruption of violence and exploration? Part of it was population pressure. Scandinavia's farmland could only support so many months. With advances in shipbuilding, particularly the longship, a sleek, flexible marvel of engineering that could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, the Norse were suddenly mobile in ways no one expected. Add to that a culture that honored daring, strength, and personal glory, and you have a recipe for expansion. They didn't just raid, they traded too. Norse merchants sailed as far as Baghdad, dealing in furs, amber, slaves, and weapons. Viking silver hoards had been found in Ireland, Russia, and even Central Asia. One of the largest Viking Age hoards, the Spillings hoard from Gotland, weighed over 67 kilograms of silver, an astonishing economic footprint. They also settled. The Vikings founded cities like Dublin, explored new lands like Iceland and Greenland, and established powerful states like the Danelaw in England and the Kievan Rus in Eastern Europe. These weren't mindless barbarians. They were brilliant navigators, farmers, blacksmiths, poets, and kings. They practiced law through assemblies called things. In Iceland, the Althing, founded in 930, is the oldest surviving parliament in the world. And their pantheon? It was rich and complex. Odin, the one-eyed god of wisdom and war. Thor, the protector of humankind. Loki, the trickster. Their myths were full of moral lessons, cosmic battles, and a belief in fate. It was a world where courage mattered more than comfort. Still, not everything was glorious. The Vikings also thrived on slavery. Thralls, captives taken in raids, were bought, sold, and used to farm and build. Viking culture, for all its fierce beauty, was not a utopia. But it was dynamic, and by the 10th century, it seemed the Northmen were unstoppable. Until the tide began to turn. Seeds of decline. No age lasts forever, even for the Vikings. By the late 10th century, the very forces that had once empowered them began to shift. The seeds of decline were subtle at first, more like ripples than waves, but they were already changing the Norse world. One of the most critical shifts was internal. The Vikings weren't just raiders anymore, they were settlers, and settling changes people. It's one thing to raid a village, it's another to govern it, tax it, and defend it. Many Vikings had begun to put down roots in England, France, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. Rollo the Viking, for example, became the first Duke of Normandy after swearing loyalty to the King of France in 911. His descendants would go on to change history, most notably William the Conqueror, who invaded England in 1066. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, kingdoms were consolidating. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, once fragmented into dozens of chieftaincies, were becoming centralized monarchies. That meant more control, but also less freedom for local warlords. Kings wanted taxes, not raids. And then came Christianity. The spread of Christianity into Scandinavia was a major turning point. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always peaceful. In Norway, King Olaf Tryggvason used a mix of preaching and brutal coercion to convert his people. Pagan temples were burned and sacred groves destroyed. Those who resisted were sometimes killed or exiled. But Christianity also offered new tools for power. It brought literacy, connections to the broader European world, and a centralized moral authority that kings could wield. Suddenly, Viking leaders weren't just warlords. They were Christian kings with divine right. And Christianity changed the culture. The old values of personal revenge, raiding for glory, and dying with a sword in hand began to fade. Concepts like sin, repentance, and heaven reshaped Norse thinking. Burial sites shifted from cremations or burial with weapons to simple Christian graves. By 1000, Iceland's leaders had formally adopted Christianity. Denmark followed suit under King Harald Bluetooth. Yes, the man the wireless tech is named after. Sweden's conversion was slower, but eventually happened by the early 12th century. So what does this mean? It means the Viking world was transforming from the inside. The daring sea kings of old were now land-holding nobles, bishops, and bureaucrats. They were writing laws, not poetry. They were building churches instead of longships. And outside Scandinavia, resistance to Viking raids had grown stronger. England, under kings like Alfred the Great, had fortified towns and organized armies. The Carolingian Empire had mobilized against Viking threats with fortified bridges and quick response forces. From 885 to 886, Vikings laid siege to Paris, but the city, defended by Count Odo, held out. The tide was turning. The Norse were still formidable, but the world was changing faster than they were. The final blows. By the dawn of the 11th century, the Viking world stood at a crossroads. It was not defeated, not yet, but it was stretched thin. The high-octane burst of conquest and exploration was giving way to something more restrained, more bureaucratic, and ultimately more vulnerable. Let's talk about Canute the Great. He was a Viking who ruled not just Denmark, but England and Norway as well, a true North Sea empire. He was crowned King of England in 1017 and eventually ruled over one of the largest territories ever held by a Norse monarch. But Canute wasn't out plundering monasteries. He was acting like a European king, minting coins, attending church, and negotiating with the Pope. In fact, Canute even visited Rome in 1027 to attend the coronation of Emperor Conrad II. That's not something a bloodthirsty raider does. That's what a Christian monarch seeking legitimacy does. But even Canute couldn't hold it all together. After he died in 1035, his empire fractured. His sons lacked his strength. England slipped from Norse control. Norway rebelled. The dream of a unified Norse empire dissolved into political chaos. Back in Scandinavia, power struggles were brewing as internal conflicts broke out. Kings assassinated rivals. Factions rose and fell. There were still battles, ships, sagas of blood and thunder, but they no longer defined an age. They were echoes. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe had adapted. No longer sitting ducks, they built castles, trained cavalry, and formed alliances that made large-scale raiding difficult. The golden days of surprise river raids were over. Then came 1066, the year many historians mark as the official end of the Viking Age. That year, Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, launched a dramatic invasion of England. He had a claim to the English throne and set out to take it with a fleet and an army the likes of which hadn't been seen in decades. And at first, he had success. He defeated local forces near York and seemed poised to advance further. But then came the Battle of Stamford Bridge. On September 25, 1066, King Harold Godwinson of England launched a surprise attack. The Vikings were caught off guard. They had left their armor on the ships. What followed was a brutal close-quarters slaughter. Harald Hardrada was killed, shot through the throat with an arrow, and the Viking force was annihilated. Of the 300 longships that brought them to England, only about 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Just 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson himself would fall at the Battle of Hastings, slain by William the Conqueror, a descendant of Vikings who now marched under the banner of Normandy. The Viking Age ended not with a bang, but with the death of its last great warrior king, who was defeated by a new kind of Europe, a Europe they helped create. After the storm. So what was left in the wake of the Viking Age? Plenty. The Vikings didn't disappear, they transformed. Their fingerprints are all over modern Europe, not just in blood, but in language, law, and lineage. Legacy. Start with language. In English, words like sky, egg, window, knife, and husband come from Old Norse. Even our days of the week, Thursday, Thor's Day, for instance, came from the Norse gods. Geographically, the Norse impact lingers. York in England was once the Viking stronghold of Jorvik. Dublin, Ireland was founded by Norse settlers. Normandy, literally land of the Northmen, was handed to Viking leader Rollo and became a hub of European politics. Even in Russia, the Kievan Rus, named for Norse Rus traders, laid the groundwork for modern Russian and Ukrainian identity. Legally, many Scandinavian regions developed early systems of justice. The Thing, a community assembly where laws were made and disputes settled, was remarkably democratic for its time. Iceland's Althing, founded in 930, is still the national parliament. And then there's the cultural legacy. The sagas, passed down orally for centuries, were eventually written in the 13th century. They tell of heroes, voyages, betrayals, and feuds. They're part history, part poetry, part myth, and they preserve the soul of the Viking Age in a way no chronicle ever could. But perhaps the most significant part of the Viking legacy is their adaptability. They didn't just raid, they integrated. In England, Scandinavians intermarried and blended into Anglo-Saxon society. In Normandy, they adopted French customs and helped shape medieval Europe. In the East, they became the Kievan Rus, bridging cultures from the Baltic to Byzantium. The end of the Viking Age wasn't really an extinction, it was a metamorphosis. By 1100, the Norse world was deeply Christian. Its raiders turned into knights, merchants, and kings. The longships were gone, the gods were gone, but their descendants would go on to shape kingdoms, write laws, and build cathedrals. And in a twist of history, those who had once been outsiders, barbarians at the gate, became part of the very system they once raided. Even today, Viking DNA lives on. A 2020 study of over 400 Viking skeletons from burial sites across Europe revealed surprising diversity. Some were from southern Europe or Asia. Some Scandinavian men were buried with Irish or Slavic artifacts. The Viking world was far more global than we thought. So how did the Viking Age really end? Conclusion. The Viking Age didn't vanish in fire or fade into myth. It evolved. What began as a burst of fearless exploration and violent conquest ended in diplomacy, faith, and legacy. The very fire that fueled their rise, mobility, independence, ambition, burned into something new. The last Viking didn't fall in battle. He knelt at an altar, crowned and converted. And yet, the spirit of the North never fully died. You see it in the place names. You hear it in our language. You feel it in stories of daring and defiance. The Viking Age ended, but the Vikings never left. So the next time you hear thunder in the sky or the crash of waves against stone, remember this. 1,000 years ago, men in longships carved their names into history. And though their age is over, their legacy sails on. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history? Impress your friends and predict the future more accurately based on past events. If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about the Vikings, check out our book, History of the Vikings, a captivating guide to the Viking Age and feared Norse seafarers such as Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Egil Skilligrimsson, and more. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.